My name is Paul McDonald. I'm a retired RAF pilot, and it's really nice to renew my acquaintance with this particular aircraft at Newark. It's Canberra PR Mark 7, so a photo reconnaissance variant of the Canberra, and this particular one is WH779, which I last flew nearly 40 years ago when I was based in Malta. I have to say that the condition it's now in, particularly in the cockpit, it does seem to be rather better than the condition that I remember flying it operationally in the 1970s. I actually joined 13 Squadron in Malta at RAF Lua in 1975. I was 26 years old, a flying officer, and it was my second tour. I'd been married for a year, so we arrived in Malta on what was a great adventure, both personally for us both and professionally, on what was my first operational tour, although my second tour in the RAF. 13th Squadron itself was equipped with two marks of the Canberra when I arrived there, the PR Mark 7, which is this one, and the PR 9. I have to say that I really wanted to fly the PR 9, which was more modern, having been built in the 60s, and much more powerful. The PR 7 was actually built in 1953, so even in 1976 it was a fairly elderly beast, although it had a remarkable capability as a photo reconnaissance aeroplane. Sadly for me, as my time on the squadron moved on, each of the PR9 variants were withdrawn back to 39th Squadron at RAF Whitton in the UK, and they were replaced with refurbished PR7. So by the end of my tour, it was the whole squadron was totally equipped with the Canberra PR7. As I say, the squadron was based at RAF Lua. It had a long association with Malta and with the Mediterranean. One of the great advantages for us as crews was that the squadron was declared both for NATO and for CENTO, which was the Central Treaty Organisation, which comprised the United States, the United Kingdom, Turkey, Iran and Pakistan. And while the squadron was jointly declared, the crews on the squadron, we were able to train in support of both organisations. So we were able to regularly return to the UK for low flying and reconnaissance practice here, but also to Germany, to RAF Larbruck, to work alongside 2 Squadron, and also to Italy, to Cyprus, and to Gibraltar. So we got a fair share of detachments and exercises throughout the Mediterranean. We could also then, of course, support CENTO, and that meant deploying to Turkey, to Iran and to Pakistan. So for a young 26-year-old to be able to operate in all these different locations, it was just a remarkable opportunity, and one tended often to go away for a week or two at a time with a particular task in mind, and it was just you, your aeroplane and your navigator, no ground crew, no other support. You looked after your own aircraft, refueled it, turned it round, and then came back when the task was complete. Some of the places we went to were really quite amazing. Mashhad in northeastern Iran was one of our regular bases. The military airport just outside Karachi was also a regular deployment base. And for CENTO exercises, we deployed to a Turkish base called Izmir in Turkey. With our NATO hat on, our forward operating base was Villafranca, just outside Verona in northern Italy. And again, quite an idyllic location to practice our role, which was very wide-ranging. It's an elderly aeroplane, was then, first built in 1949, and quite remarkable. The very final Canberras, the PR9, were withdrawn from operational service in 2004, which was a remarkable achievement for any aircraft. We were used to what we call wet film, so the cameras on the aircraft would take normal film, which would be developed in what was called an ATRL, an Air Transportable Reconnaissance Exploitation Laboratory. then the big rolls of negative film would be put on a light table and rolled across for a very skilled team of photographic interpreters who would then view the film using stereoscopes, because a number of the cameras were set up so that one could get stereographic images of what we were taking. At low level, we would operate the F95 camera, and we could fly with 3. There would be one which could be mounted in the nose, and also one on either side of the fuselage, which would be set at an angle. And those would be principally used for low-level reconnaissance roles. For high-level reconnaissance, we had a range of cameras: a vertical camera, 2 very long focal length cameras, which were mounted just off the vertical to give a stereoscopic image, and then we had what was called the PFO, the port-facing oblique, which would be mounted in the forward section of the aircraft, but at an angle. And this could either have a 36 or a 48-inch focal length, so it was a huge camera. The great advantage of that particular oblique camera was that it allowed you to stand off from a border or a coastline by some 30 miles or so to get imagery. The challenge for the crew was that the navigator would be lying down the nose, ensuring that tracking was good for the high-level photography, and the pilot, once the cameras were running, must not at all bank the aircraft. So if the aircraft needed to turn because the coastline turned, then you had to use a rudder and do a flat turn to try and get round the corner to get the appropriate overlap of imagery. And overlap was very, very important. For this particular aircraft, WH779, I suspect it wasn't on 13 Squadron's books when I first arrived, because my first sortie was actually in 1976 in this particular aircraft. But over the next 2 years, I flew 779 about 30 times, totaling about 65 hours, and some of those trips were particularly memorable. So on the day in question, we got airborne and headed northwest from Malta, climbing to high level, until we were positioned somewhere south of Sardinia, and then we dropped down in the hope that we'd actually find this small task force. And it was very much by guess and by God whether we were in the right area. But before long, we came across, the fairly substantial wake from these 3 quite obviously military vessels. And no sooner had we got down to low level than they all turned into wind. And that could only mean one thing, that they were about to launch their aircraft. These 2 aircraft on the stern weren't models or anything, just to fool NATO analysts. They were an aircraft called the Forger. And we'd only been on the scene for 2 to 3 minutes when one of them actually got airborne, which was a startling discovery. They weren't interested in us. They were obviously just doing a little bit of training. So I did my very best to fly around and try and keep pace as they did long circuits around the aircraft carrier, probably going out to about 2 miles before making an approach to come into land. And I did position the aircraft on the right of one of these forges, a couple of 100 yards away, and tried to get some decent imagery, which was a bit of a challenge, of course, because the Forger could land vertically, so he could end up going a lot slower than I could. So even the old Canberra, got a bit wobbly towards the end, but I think we did get some fairly decent photographs. So that for us was a bit of a coup, and we were quite delighted. A few days later, we had a second sortie against the Kiev, as it was nearby, and we again virtually filled our magazines. We'd been there a few minutes when an RAF Phantom arrived. He was on exercise with his squadron in Malta, and he'd just come across to have a look. We were on the same radio frequency, so we had a chat, and we came up with the idea of trying to get a photograph of the RAF Phantom overhead the Kiev. And we spent so long trying to set this up that none of us actually were looking at the Kiev at the time. And it wasn't until the photographic interpreters looked at the film afterwards that they realised that the Soviets were tracking the Phantom with a twin 76mm gun and they'd also got the SAN-3 Goa missile on its launcher and were tracking one of us at the same time too. And that was the first time the Goa had been seen on a launcher on board the Kiev, except we hadn't seen it, but thankfully our cameras had. The third sortie, probably the most interesting by far, and certainly most exciting, came a few weeks later in March of 1978. Fred and I lived, we were close neighbours in Malta, and we often shared cars going into work. And this particular day, as we drove in, we were convinced there'd be no flying because the windsock was absolutely horizontal. A very strong wind from the northwest, and about 90 degrees off the runway that we used, runway 2406 at Lua. So we were convinced that by midday, we'd, in the words we were describing, we'd scrub to the pub and perhaps have a refreshing pint of chisk before heading home that afternoon. A few minutes later, we sat in the crew room, and I think everyone was of the same mind when the squawk box on the walls came into action, and we were summoned to the ops room to go and see the acting squadron commander. And when we got to the top of the stairs, he announced to our shock that we'd be getting airborne, and we were to join him in his car and drive across to the intelligence section for a briefing. And we were quite gobsmacked, because even as we drove across, it looked as though the weather was actually worse. There was no flying at all taking place. Even the weekly RAF VC-10 had been diverted to Sigonella in Sicily. As the intelligence brief unfolded, it was clear that the intelligence community wanted more information about Kiev, which was thought to be on its way back. This would be the final occasion when it would be close to Malta. There was some doubt as to where it was. Because of the sea state, it was suggested that it would be skirting the Libyan coast before heading up to the northwest towards Sardinia again. But that was pretty vague. And what the intelligence community really wanted to look at was what appeared to be some sort of gate on the stern of the ship. And they were quite intrigued by that, and they hoped that because of the rough seas, we might be able to position our aircraft to get a photograph of the stern just out of the water. I managed to keep my thoughts to myself at that stage, because I don't think they really understood what that meant in terms of flying the aircraft. In theory, we were supposed to avoid aircraft carriers by about 2 miles and 2,000 feet. The reality was that our air commander was of the view that providing we came back with the goods, he would turn a blind eye to actually how we went about achieving them. But we couldn't move the cameras. The only thing we could do was to position the aircraft in such a way that the cameras would see what we wanted. We could never tell at the time whether we'd been successful. We'd have to wait until we got back to base. But to get a photograph of the stern out of the water meant that we would have to fly very, very low indeed. As we drove back, it was quite clear that the acting squadron commander was comfortable that he would authorise us for this sortie, and we duly met up with our engineers and got out to the aircraft. But the wind was much too strong for us to start the aircraft in dispersal or even taxi the aircraft. So we strapped in. The engine blanks were kept on the aircraft, so nothing could blow into the engines, and the control locks on the ailerons and on the tailplane were kept in place, and we were actually towed out to the threshold of runway 24. The crosswind technique for the Canberra was not to point down the runway for takeoff, but to point about 30 degrees off into wind. And the plan was that we'd run the engines up once we'd got everything clear, and run the engines up to maximum continuous RPM. Our boss would be in the tower giving us constant readouts of the wind, and when it dropped to less than 30 knots crosswind component, then we'd go for it. The aircraft's limitation for crosswind was 25 knots, so it was already accepted we'd be taking off outside the normal limitations. Takeoff, in fact, was straightforward. There was no big issues, even though this is an incredibly heavy beast when it's fully fueled, and it does take an awful lot of runway especially in the Mediterranean, to get airborne. As soon as we were airborne, then Fred adopted his normal position, which was not in his ejection seat behind the pilot. He would unstrap, crawl down the nose, so he'd be looking down the front. Obviously, we often practiced getting from there back into his ejection seat, and he was pretty good at it. All the navigators were. But that's where he'd spend most of his time, whether it was at low level or at high level. Off we went, heading towards the Libyan coast to see if we could find Kiev and her two escorts. But we had no success. We spent probably the best part of 2 hours searching. Occasionally we'd get into a good area of good visibility where we could see for 8 or 9 miles. Others, there were regular squalls that were coming through, and visibility would drop to less than a mile, half a mile in some cases. The sea state was truly awful, and I thank my lucky stars I'd elected for a career in the Royal Air Force rather than the Royal Navy. But there was nowhere I would ever have wished to have ended up in that sea as it was. We were just about to give up when Fred came up with the idea. He said, "Well," he says, "if it was up to me, I would have gone in a straight line, and I would have gone between Malta and Sicily if I was that Soviet captain." So we thought, well, let's go and have a look and see if we can see anything. And within a few minutes, we found the Krivak, which is actually quite a big destroyer, but it was making no headway at all. It was pointed in the wind, but it was not moving. Now we knew we were close. Soon after that, we found the Kara, which was probably doing about 1 or 2 knots at most. We got some good photographs of both of them, and then not long afterwards we came across the Kiev. It was quite a magnificent sight. It's a huge ship, 900 feet long, but in that sea state, the bows were coming up and down. It was quite spectacular, and we quickly set about taking whatever photographs we could, running alongside the deck on both sides, across the bow, across the stern, concentrating on the stern to try and get the shots that the intelligence folk wanted. We just did the best we could until we virtually used all our film. That did mean flying pretty low, and there were times when we were flying at deck level and below deck level, so we were less than 50 feet occasionally. And then we headed back for Malta. And of course, landing at Lure in those winds would be a challenge, and it had been agreed that the disused former Fleet Air Arm base at Hal Farm would be reopened just for us. It had been closed for about 6 years, but the squadron had sent a sweeper to sweep the interwind runway, which started just from the cliff and was virtually straight into the headwind, and they sent the fire crews and an ambulance down there to await us. I called up and asked whether it would be possible for me to practice a couple of circuits at Lure first, just to see what the wind felt like before going to land at Hal Farm. But the squadron commander insisted that we go straight to Hal Farm and attempt to land it. They were very keen indeed on exploiting this film, whatever the magazines contained. By then Fred had got back into his seat, strapped in. That in itself is not a straightforward task, because these are very old ejection seats, so you had to get into the seat, strap into the parachute, and then put on a second harness to strap you into the ejection seat as well. So we did our first circuit and approach, and that's when I realised that I couldn't see. While we'd been flying around at low level, at 300 to 400 knots, it hadn't been a particular problem. But as soon as we slowed down to approach speed, it became clear that the bottom few inches of the canopy were covered in salt, and I couldn't see anything out of it. If I increased speed, then the nose would lower, but I'd have to bring the wheels up. And I'd be going far too fast to be able to get them down again to effect a landing. So I explained this to Fred, and he was out of his seat like a shot, straight back down the nose. We tried again, but of course he had the same problem. He could see out the top of the nose, but as soon as we slowed down to approach speed, he couldn't see a thing. So we explained that to our squadron commander, who was, I think, a bit lost for words. He was unable to offer any advice apart from let's go back to Luca and have a look. And so we did. And that's when a most remarkable piece of design came into its own. I'm not sure whether you can see it, or perhaps later, but on the other side of the canopy there's a small circular window called a DV window, direct vision window, which is heated, and it was designed primarily if the canopy froze up at very high level. But for us this was perfect because it was just on the left hand side of the canopy, and when I made an attempt to land, I could actually see through this small circular window down the runway to make an approach, and that worked well. And then just before touchdown, the technique in the Canberra was then to give a big boot full of rudder to swing the nose onto the runway direction and touch down, and that worked to a point. And that the port main wheel touched down, obviously there was then a big gust of wind, and I couldn't persuade the starboard wheel to touch down, so even full aileron and a little bit of rudder didn't help either. And we went down the runway on one wheel for a few hundred feet until eventually the starboard wheel touched down. Probably 20 minutes later we were in the flight planning room with the film being rolled out. We could barely get near, even though we'd taken the photographs. It was surrounded by the intelligence folk, the photographic interpreters, every man and his dog, and we were trying to muscle in so we could have a look. But as they were moving the film over and over, going no, 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 obviously we hadn't got what they wanted. We hadn't got the gate. Until suddenly there was a cry from the senior intelligence officer, and they rolled the phone back and they were looking not at the stern, which is what we'd been after, but at the bow, because we had got a brilliant shot at very low level of the bow completely clear of the water. We had to ask, well, is that really important? And they said this is really good stuff, because a naval architect could work out an awful lot of information from the shape of the bow and come up with decent figures for displacement, speeds, etc. And they remarked at the time that this photograph was probably the intelligence scoop of the year. It wasn't. It was the intelligence scoop of the decade. So it was a remarkable piece of film, and we were absolutely delighted to have been in the right place at the right time. My first tour began in 1973, and then I joined 13th Squadron in 1975. But for a significant period before that, it did look as though my ambitions to join the Royal Air Force would count for nothing. There was one thing, and one thing only, and that was in my favour, and that was the Air Cadets. I grew up in just outside the town of Consett in County Durham, in the northeast of England. My father was a steel worker. We lived on a vast council estate to the west of the steel town, and certainly in the late 1960s, children from that area didn't aspire for commissioned service in the armed forces. But from about the age of 13 or 14, that was my sole focus, to join the Royal Air Force, despite some major obstacles, many of which are of my own making, in the way. At school, I went to a grammar school in Heaven, just outside Gateshead, but I was a bit of a minimum worker, and I kind of collected GCEs, as they were, over a period of years. It even took me 3 attempts to get O-level maths. So my aspirations to join the RAF didn't really sit very comfortably with how I was performing academically. I wasn't particularly sporty either, so I had no advantage in that area. But I'd been a cadet from the age of 14 in the local Consett Squadron, 1409 Squadron, and that gave me a slight inside edge into what to expect in joining the RAF. I was lucky to get a gliding scholarship, so I got my gliding wings when I was 16. And then I got a flying scholarship at the age of 17. So by the time I was 18, I'd got a private pilot's license. mostly paid for by the Royal Air Force, flying Cessnas at Carlisle. And I thought with that under my belt, then getting into the RAF as a pilot was a racing certainty. But of course it wasn't. I applied to join when I was 18 so that I could go straight in from school. I went down to Biggin Hill for all the appropriate selection tests, and I passed the medical, I passed the aptitude tests, but I failed the leadership tests, which came as a huge blow. But I failed them rightly so. I was young, I was naive, I was immature. I certainly didn't have what was necessary for commissioned service in those days. Soon afterwards I failed one of my A-levels, so even the opportunity to go to college disappeared pretty quick. And I ended up working for an estate agent in County Durham for about 3.5 years until I was 21. I continued to work with the cadets. I became a civilian instructor, and then I was commissioned in the RAF VRT to work with the Air Cadets in concert. I've been commissioned in the reserve for just over 6 months when I began to think again about a career in the RAF. Certainly I didn't think my future as an estate agent would be as interesting as I wished. So I applied once more to join the RAF, and so I was back to Biggin Hill. This time I did pass the leadership test, so I was offered a commission. However, the RAF judged that as I'd been there once before and had passed the aptitude tests previously, there was a weighting put on my scores for aptitude. So instead of being offered pilot training, I was offered navigator training, which I was happy to accept. Luckily for me, there was a shortfall. So a few days before I began officer training at Henlow, the RAF offered me the choice of switching to go into pilot training, which I was happy to do. Officer training was reasonably straightforward, although I have to say, when I first stepped into the cadets mess and subsequently officers messes, I stepped right out of my comfort zone. This was not, the manner in which I'd been used to. And I think I learned fairly quickly that it was a really good idea to keep your eyes open and your ears open and your mouth shut until you actually knew what you were doing. So I was commissioned in June of 1971, and then I was told I was going directly onto this aircraft, the Jet Provost Mark III, and that was all because I'd done a flying scholarship 5 years earlier on the Cessna, so I bypassed the elementary flying training and the Chipmunk, which I have to say in retrospect was probably a good thing, because I think the Chipmunk would have proved a bit of a challenge. So I went straight to Leeming for a 1-year course in the Jet Provost Mark III and the Mark V, getting my wings at the end of that course. We were then split between three roles, fast jet, multi-engine or rotary. In our course of 12 we split at something like 5-5-2, 5 to fast jet, 5 to multi-engine, 2 to rotary. And I was one of those who was selected for fast jet training on the Gnat at RAF Valley, where we were joined by other graduates from the flying training school at Linton and also from Cranwell to again make up a course of 12. The course on the Gnat was extremely demanding. It was a very demanding aeroplane, very, very fast. Of that course of 12, 7 of us were successful and finished the course, but 2 of us were posted to Canberra's. In fact, only 3 ended up on fast jets, and within a year or two, only 1 of those was still a fast jet pilot. So, what was called the wastage rate during flying training was very, very high indeed. So at the end of flying training, I went off to the Canberra OCU at Cottesmore, and then I was posted to 7th Squadron, which was a target towing squadron based at St Morgan in Cornwall. And it was after about 21 months on 7 that I had this dream posting to 13th Squadron, which is where my association with WH779 began. After my tour on 13th Squadron, I was still desperately hoping to get to fast jets. And I always had an aspiration to fly the Buccaneer, which never came about. But at the end of 13, I was posted back to RAF Leeming, to the Central Flying School, to become an instructor. So I became an instructor again on the Jet Provost, the Mark III, and also the Mark V, and stayed at Leeming for about 3.5 years as an instructor. While I was there, I was very lucky to be selected to fly the Meteor, a Meteor T7, with a display team that the Central Flying School operated called the Vintage Pair, which comprised a Vampire Mark 11 and a Meteor T7. So I flew the Meteor for 2 years at various displays throughout the UK, which was an incredible opportunity. It was a dream aircraft and a very popular team. Probably the most notable formation I ever flew in was whilst I was with that team, that we had the privilege of closing the show at Strathallan in 1980, in which the Vampire led the formation. I flew in line astern behind the Vampire, and a Mosquito flew in line astern on me. And on our wings we had a Spitfire and a Hurricane. A very memorable fly past. That's all it wasn't. It wasn't a display. But I always regretted never having a photograph of something which had to be unique. I can't ever imagine any other circumstances in which those 5 aircraft would have been seen together. Years ago, my son, unbeknownst to me, began to make contact with various aviation enthusiast websites and managed to find a chap who, as a youngster, had attended the Strathallan Air Display in 1980, and he had a single photograph of that unique formation, which he was very happy to let me have. And luckily, while it's a distant photograph, it's quite clear that there are 5 quite unique aeroplanes shown together in the skies over Strathallan. And that, luckily, we've been able to get into the book Winged Warriors. Throughout my service, I've been very lucky to have been very well supported by my wife Jackie. We have 2 children, Matthew and Hannah. Wherever I've been posted to, Jackie has come to. And so we've had a fantastic opportunity living in a range of countries. About 14 years we spent overseas, including 4 years in Kuwait, where I worked as an advisor to the Kuwait Air Force. Our daughter Hannah followed me into the Air Force, which came as a great shock. She's actually got more operational time than I have, having served twice in Iraq and once in Afghanistan. My son is married to an American and lives in Los Angeles, and they produced a grandson for us about 4 years ago, and that set me off on another little route of writing, because it seemed to me that our grandson Joaquin will grow up a long way from the UK, and his only knowledge of what went on here during the Cold War and afterwards, what the small Royal Air Force is all about, will just come from boring stories from his old granddad. So I began writing stuff down, and it just developed from there, until our daughter Hannah read the opening part of what I'd written, which actually was describing the sortie that I flew in a Canberra PR7 against the Kiev, against the Soviet carrier. And having read this, she then got hold of it and asked me, "Is this true?" And I said, "Well, yes." And she said, "Well, where's the rest?" So she demanded to read the rest of the story, which she did in about 14 hours non-stop, and then demanded that I seek a publisher and try and get it published. And very lucky that I approached the publisher Pen & Sword from Barnsley, and quickly signed a contract, and that book was published in October 2012. It goes by the name of Winged Warriors, the Cold War from the Cockpit, and it seems to have quite successful within the market of military memoirs. I think I was then bitten by the bug, really. So for the last 2 years I've been working on a second book. It's a historical biography based on principally 2 characters, but with a number of others who are involved. The 2 main characters, a chap called Adrian Walbert, who was the RAF's most decorated reconnaissance pilot ever, and he sadly went missing at the age of 26 as a wing commander, and he was found still in the wreckage of his aircraft in 2002 in Bavaria when I was serving at Ramstein. So I became very slightly involved with the arrangements that were then made for his funeral. He was linked with another English girl from Cheshire, a girl called Christina Radcliffe, who had ended up being virtually marooned in Malta at the beginning of the Second World War. She was a dancer, she became an RAF plotter, and she and Adrian became very much a couple. She was very much a heroine in her own right, but never knew what happened to the love of her life, because she went to her grave in 1988, some 14 years before Adrian was found. So wherever they are, they're probably both together now. So I've been working to try and bring their story together and try and tell it against a backdrop of the air war of Malta. So hopefully, if I can persuade my publisher, maybe that will hit the shelves next year sometime. Go by the title of Finding Warby and Christina, a true story of love, loss and wartime Malta. Okay. The 779 is one of a number of cockpits that are here on display at Newark, all maintained by volunteers, enthusiasts, many of whom have spent an absolute fortune in buying, including the team headed by Darren, who look after 779, and they do a remarkable job giving up their own time to show the public a little bit of the RAF's history. While the RAF has great museums at Hendon and Duxford, the rest of us who live up north, this is the best, and it's heartening to know that there are enthusiasts, many of whom have had no connection with the RAF, who kind of maintain the legacy and keep the history of what the RAF was about. They keep it alive. And if you'd like to find out more, then there is a website designed by my son, which is www